If you're trying to measure biodiversity loss in the ocean today, you run into this massive historical problem. We often just don't know what that ecosystem looked like before we started messing with it, you know? We're constantly battling this shifting baseline syndrome where we sort of assume current conditions are normal. We forget that huge changes might have happened centuries ago, way before modern monitoring even existed.
Exactly. And to really understand current marine health, to measure extinctions or community shifts happening now, we desperately need that pre-industrial baseline. And crucially, we have to figure out what was human impact versus what was just natural climate fluctuation back then. That's really the whole mission of the deep dive we're taking today. We're looking at the paper, Ancient Environmental DNA Indicates Limited Human Impact on Marine Biodiversity in Pre-Industrial Iceland, led by Holman and his colleagues.
Okay, so what we're diving into is how this team essentially built a kind of time machine for Iceland's ocean, reconstructing marine life over 3,000 years from about 1315 BCE right up to 1785 CE. That time frame covers massive climate shifts and, importantly, the entire history of pre-industrial human settlement and, well, pretty heavy exploitation in the North Atlantic.
And Iceland is really the perfect place for this kind of detective work. It was one of the very last habitable places settled by humans around 877 CE. So because they arrived so late, it gives researchers this rare glimpse of a relatively pristine marine baseline right before the Norse and Gaelic settlers showed up.
Right, and the contrast they found between what happened on land versus in the sea is pretty stark, isn't it? The source material points out that the early settlers caused immediate, complete shifts in terrestrial biodiversity. We're talking rapid deforestation, total deforestation, really, intensive grazing, massive soil erosion, basically ecological devastation on the island itself.
Oh, absolutely devastating on land. Yet, despite that immediate, almost total terrestrial collapse, by the 11th century, the settlers had already shifted their focus. They started relying heavily on marine resources. And the zoological records, the animal bones found in digs, confirm this. You see a clear shift from finds dominated by land mammals to finds just overwhelmingly dominated by marine fish.
And it wasn't just, catching fish for dinner locally. Atlantic cod, Goddess morhua, became the cornerstone of this huge export fishery. It actually fueled urban growth across Europe from the 13th up to the 17th centuries. This was big business. It went on for centuries.
So that really sets up the core tension of this paper, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Given the total collapse on land and this widespread, heavy, centuries-long exploitation of marine resources, especially cod, what measurable impact did these pre-industrial Icelanders actually have on the marine ecosystem itself? If they wiped out the land that fast, why would the same thing happen to the cod stocks, their main resource?
Okay, let's unpack how they answered that. The key is the technology. Ancient Environmental DNA, or eDNA. This is essentially reading a geological time archive, right? Organisms, tiny plankton, fish, bacteria, everything shed DNA throughout their lives. And that genetic material settles down into the marine sediment, layer by layer, creating a record.
Exactly. And that sediment archive is phenomenal because it's a direct record of who was there and when. So the team analyzed sediment cores collected from the North Icelandic Shelf, 2 of them, BZ-19 and GCO-1. And to date these cores with precision over 3 millennia, they use a combo approach, radiocarbon dating, plus these very specific volcanic markers called tephra layers, like the Hecla 1300, tephra H1300. They act like geological bookmarks.
Geological bookmarks, I like that. And what were they actually looking for in those layers? They used something called 18S metabarcoding. What did that let them see exactly?
Right, 18S metabarcoding is the sequencing process they use. It specifically targets eukaryotes. So essentially all complex life, everything from animals and fish down to tiny protists. This gave them a way to reconstruct the entire past community structure, not just, say, 1 or 2 fish populations.
And crucially, to connect this genetic archive back to the real world, they cross-referenced everything. They focused specifically on the detection of cod, the genus Gadus, and herring, Clupea. And they compared that eDNA data with contextual information, things like historical human population estimates for Iceland, archaeological evidence showing fishing intensity, and multiple climate proxies, too.
Yeah, that context is absolutely crucial. You need to know what the climate was doing at the same time. So they looked at sea surface temperature, SST proxies, and also a specific sea ice proxy called IP25. IP25 is this chemical compound produced by certain diatoms that grow in sea ice. So its presence or absence in the sediment gives us a direct marker of how much sea ice was around during that period.
Okay, so they've got the DNA, the dates, the climate context. What did they find? Because this is where the story takes a pretty surprising turn. The main finding, looking at broad biodiversity, all the animals, protists, bacteria, was surprising stability. The ecosystem showed overall relative stability across the entire 3,000-year study period.
Yeah.
They didn't see the kind of large-scale taxonomic shifts you might expect if humans were dramatically restructuring the ocean back then.
Exactly right. For instance, looking at diatoms, which are tiny phytoplankton, the base of the food web, one particular genus, Chytoceras, remained the dominant proportion of sequences across almost all the samples. That suggests the overall food web structure was either incredibly resilient or maybe just operating at a scale that human activity hadn't fundamentally altered yet.
But then we hit what you called the cod paradox. And this is frankly kind of shocking. Despite cod being the most exploited species, the primary export for centuries, the detection rates of Atlantic cod, goddess, in those sediment cores showed, well, no clear change, none, over the entire time series. The evidence of centuries of heavy fishing pressure just wasn't there in the eDNA signal.
It's really puzzling, and this is why the herring data becomes the crucial clue. Herring, the genus Clupea, was not a focus of Icelandic subsistence fishing or the big export fisheries during this pre-industrial time. They weren't really targeting it. Yet the eDNA showed a really clear decrease in herring detections across the time series. In fact, there was no detection at all from the 12th century onwards.
Yeah.
Banished from the record.
Wait, hold on, let me get this straight. The fish they weren't really touching declined, maybe disappeared locally, but the fish they were hammering for export across Europe seemed stable in the local eDNA record. That feels completely upside down.
It is the core finding, and it does seem counterintuitive at first. The stability of cod detection is, well, perplexing. We'll come back to that. But the decline of herring seemed to provide the answer about the dominant force shaping at least that part of the ecosystem. Because the researchers found a strong, positive linear relationship between the proportion of herring DNA detected and the sea surface temperature proxies.
Okay, a positive relationship, and you said strong. Statistically significant.
Very significant. The R-squared value was 0.49. which in simple terms means that nearly half, 49% of the variation, the ups and downs in herring detection across those millennia, can be statistically explained just by changes in ocean temperature, climate, basically.
Wow, nearly half explained by temperature alone. That's a powerful climate signal. So what was the climate doing during this long period?
Well, the overall long-term trend during the study period from 1315 BCE to 1785 CE was one of cooling. There was increasing sea ice, which points to an increasing influx of cold polar water onto the North Icelandic shelf. And this cooling likely caused the larger Norwegian spring-spawning herring stock, which uses this area for feeding, to shift its feeding grounds. Probably shifted them eastward, away from where these sediment cores were taken. So fewer herring in the immediate area meant less herring DNA ending up in the sediment, a decline driven by temperature shifts, not human fishing pressure on herring.
Okay, so if we connect all these dots, pull it together for the bigger picture. The overall conclusion seems to be that despite, that massive terrestrial degradation and a multi-century, really substantial export fishery focused on cod, pre-industrial Icelandic society appears to have had a surprisingly limited effect on the broad marine biodiversity and the general taxonomic structure, at least up to 1785 CE. Climate seems to have been the bigger player, certainly for herring.
That's the main takeaway, yes. It helps define that much-needed pre-industrial baseline we talked about at the start. Now, we absolutely must acknowledge that pre-industrial humans did have some intense local impacts. The paper mentions the local extirpation, basically wiping out of the walrus, Odobinus rosmarus, in the 11th, 12th centuries. That's a clear example of human overexploitation. But that appears to have been perhaps an exception affecting a specific vulnerable species. The broad ecological structure, as captured by this eDNA method, remained largely stable through huge societal and climatic shifts.
We still have that cod discrepancy, don't we? We can't just brush that aside. We know there's other research out there, like studies using fish otoliths, the ear bones found in archaeological sites from the period. And those studies suggest that the total mortality rate for the cod population was elevated due to fishing pressure, starting maybe from the 14th century onwards. So how do we square the eDNA showing stability with archaeological data suggesting rising fishing mortality for cod?
Right, and this points directly to what's likely the primary limitation of using sedimentary ancient DNA for certain questions. While the fact that they got consistent results from two different core samples gives us confidence in the method itself, the sediment core probably reflects only a local signal. It's a snapshot of the community in the immediate vicinity of the core site. Highly mobile species like cod, which migrate and move across vast areas, are subject to regional population dynamics. The whole stock matters.
Ah, okay. So it's potentially a spatial scale mismatch. Fishing pressure might be affecting the entire regional cod stock, causing overall mortality to rise, as the otoliths suggest. But the sediment core is just reading the local neighborhood, maybe where a small, stable group of cod happen to persist near the sampling sites. So the eDNA is great for tracking local presence absence or relative abundance nearby, but maybe not for the total size of a huge mobile population stock.
Precisely. That's the most likely explanation for the discrepancy. And that's why this research is so foundational. It helps us understand the baseline state, but also the strengths and limitations of these powerful new tools like cDNA. And critically, you have to remember, these cDNA records end in 1785 CE. That's just before the European Industrial Revolution really kicked into high gear, bringing mechanization to fishing.
Right. So the obvious next step, the goal now has to be extending this eDNA time series forward in time into the industrial period, the late 18th, 19th, 20th centuries. That would provide the crucial link, wouldn't it? Connecting these findings of relative pre-industrial stability to the truly catastrophic changes, like the complete collapse of some major Icelandic fish stocks that we know happened in the modern mechanized fishing era.
Absolutely. That extension is key. If we look at the sort of aha moment from this study, though, it's realizing that even in an area with significant centuries-long fishing pressure on one species, cod, climate was still arguably the dominant factor shaping the dynamics of other key mobile marine populations, like herring, in the pre-industrial North Atlantic. It suggests that pre-industrial fishing, even large export fisheries, might have operated below the threshold needed to cause widespread ecological restructuring in a system as vast and dynamic as the North Atlantic shelf, at least detectable restructuring with this method.
That really reframes the narrative of human impact, doesn't it? It suggests the age of truly monumental, broad-scale marine ecosystem collapse might really be an industrial era and perhaps post-industrial era phenomenon.
Which brings us to a final thought, something perhaps for you, the listener, to consider. If pre-industrial human activity, despite its intensity in some ways, had relatively limited broad-scale impact on marine biodiversity detectable with this method, what will the eDNA record of the North Icelandic shelf look like once it does extend past that 1785 CE cutoff? When it moves into the age of engine-powered trawlers, industrial-scale fishing, global markets, and of course accelerating human-driven climate change. The difference revealed between those two periods, the pre-industrial baseline and the industrial impact, is likely to be the most dramatic ecological shift recorded in those sediments across the last 3 millennia.